I came up in an area, born in a rural area of Georgia, where most people, both black and white, didn't even know how to read, much less write. But I always liked stories. And I wanted to record and sort of have a setting for these people that I wanted to write about, I had grown up with, knew about.
Raymond Andrews was an American author from Georgia. By the time of his suicide, he had authored 6 books, all of them set in the South, all of them dealing with issues of race, identity, family, and perseverance. His time in the national spotlight was brief, but the stories he told were made to last.
He was a completely original writer.
His writing approach was a very simple one. I would say it was a very honest one.
He confronted an issue in Southern culture that nobody else was confronting.
Andrews wrote of African Americans in the South. He wrote of racial tension and racial mixing. He revealed a beautiful and complex culture.
I write about a county, Muskegon County, and all the people that I made up all of the people. They're all composites. I made them up. But I think this is very, very typical of writers, Southern writers. It's listening to stories because I suppose it comes from most people at the time not knowing how to read and would just pass along stories from generation to generation.
In Raymond Andrews' work, you have 30 main characters. You have the storyline zigzags all over the place. It always comes back to something, but it's as if a storyteller is telling you a story about something and then decides, well, I need to tell you this.
He's gone back to the country and he's really telling stories that on the surface seem quite quaint and folksy, though there's a lot of truthful social tension beneath the surface, and he's really telling, I think, the real story of the South and real story of race relations.
The most blacks I ever read about in literature, American literature, was always just victims. They weren't real people. They were either being lynched or they were very noble savages or whatever. And I wanted to write about real people. I wanted to write about black people who could make mistakes and to get in trouble, and also that was good people and bad people. That's what I wanted to write about. And I figured that if you write what you want to, I figured there are enough people out there who really want to read you once they know you're there.
The stories Raymond Andrews told were of humble people living life as free as they could. Ray himself lived life with zest, and along with his brother, the artist Benny Andrews, he reached heights few would have predicted. But like most of his characters, Ray came from very humble beginnings. Plainview, Georgia is a small, rural community 60 miles east of Atlanta. Today, it is populated mostly by pine trees and a few residents who identify themselves as citizens of Madison, the bucolic seat of Morgan County. But 75 years ago, it was home to a few wealthy white landowners and dozens of African American families who were socially and economically tethered to the land.
We live in a small country house out in the cornfield.
It was 2 rooms, and the kitchen, there was a single bed my oldest brother, Harvey, slept on.
And Benny and Raymond and I, we slept crossway to bed together. And my mother and father and the other child slept in another bed.
It was said in Plainview that George and Viola Andrews practiced birth control because they had only 10 children. The oldest brother was Harvey, and the oldest sister was Valeria. Next came a close-knit pair named Benny and Raymond. They were followed by Shirley and Harold, who the other children called Joe Lewis. These older children had left the house when Johnny, Dolores, Veronica, and Gregory came along. The extended family included Grandma Jesse Andrews, the mixed-race mother of Plainview, and Uncle Fred, or Bubba Andrews, a handsome and flamboyant cab driver. He was called a sport by his peers. These relatives fascinated the children, but they were products of their parents. Viola was a homemaker and Sunday school teacher who tried to instill faith and discipline in her children.
My mother used to give us math classes at home.
She was a very, very strong woman, a woman who was always looking for the best for her children and who always expected the best for her children.
Every morning before we do anything, we had to say the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." We had to say that, and also we had to say the first Psalm, which is "Blessed is the man." We had to say our prayers together. Every night before we would go to bed, we had to pray together. Everybody had to get together except my daddy.
George Andrews only stepped inside Plainview Church when there was thunder and lightning outside. Only then did he fear God. George was known simply as G to his peers. G played a little guitar, but mostly he scratched out a living for his family by turning the red soil of the region.
My father was regarded by his peers in the community as a very kind man, cooperative. He was a pleaser.
Well, G was kind of a loner-like fella. He kept to himself most time, best he could, you know. And he wasn't gonna pull that cap off. No, that cap was made to him, and he wasn't pulling it off, don't care what happened.
G tried hard to get along because underneath he felt like an outsider. His mother, Jessie Andrews, also known as Jessie Lee Wildcat Tennessee, was part black and part Cherokee. His father, Jim Orr, was a reclusive white landowner who never acknowledged his children. He only allowed them to call him Mr. Jim. George's skin was as pale as a dogwood blossom, and his eyes were sky blue. He always kept his hat pulled tight over his curly yellowish hair. Some of his children turned out just as light.
One of my sisters is blonde, and whenever she would go out later in life, for example, she'd go to a store with my mother, and the clerk would hand my mother the thing, because white women didn't carry stuff, they were with their maids. And of course my mother would say, "Hey, this is hers, take it, Val, take your own stuff."
If I walk down the streets, then the people were saying, oh white, oh hey white, oh yellow, you white, you think you something, all that.
So the family turned into each other for support and understanding, because our family felt that we were okay. Our parents, especially our mother, drilled it into us that we were okay, you're okay, you're okay, you're okay. So it enabled us to take that from both races from the outside.
But Viola couldn't protect her children from the realities of the Jim Crow South. They attended a substandard school only on rainy days. When the weather was nice, they had to go to work in the cotton fields with their father. Young Raymond heard a local legend that killing and burying a grasshopper would bring rain. His row in the field soon became a grasshopper graveyard.
Ray was considered lazy, and he would play and daydream and talk to himself up and down the roads.
Raymond was always a quiet boy, as far as I know of him, and I think the boy done a lot of thinking.
Mostly, Raymond thought about radio shows. The family was one of the few in Plainview that actually had an old Silvertone radio in their home.
I still enjoy radio because I was able to, as a child, to imagine a lot with it. And this way, you could always put the picture in your mind. You could put the picture in yourself.
Benny and Raymond also sharpened their imaginations with stories from newspaper comics. Eventually, they learned to make their own.
We're always making up stories about what was this and that, and living out fantasies and things.
They would look at the comics and read the paper together, and my father would draw and Raymond would tell stories.
Raymond would one day write of his childhood. While growing up in Morgan County, I always wanted to be somebody else, somewhere else. I wanted to be somebody else in places like New York City, Hollywood, even Russia. Ray never made it to Russia, but he made it almost everywhere else. The first stop, Atlanta, Georgia. Mid-century Atlanta was a train track town, but Raymond Andrews arrived by bus. Andrews would one day write, "When the big Greyhound bus pulled into the Atlanta bus station that late Sunday morning of December 4th, 1949, I knew I had to act as if I'd been there before. Be cool." At age 15, it was my first trip of more than 5 miles from home. Well, he certainly hadn't been there before, and at first, he didn't act cool. The segregated bus system brought him nasty looks when he sat in the rear, reserved for blacks, but if he sat in front, he could have faced jail. When he did ride the bus, he went for a seat near the middle, but more often, he just walked. He walked from Butler Street to Auburn Avenue and up to Peachtree Street, where he worked at the Rich's department store. Raymond lived with Benny at the Butler Street YMCA. It was an important transition point for young black men moving to the city, where they could find jobs and escape the hold of sharecropping. Raymond attended high school at night with his sister, but he spent most of his time with Benny.
Guys would say, if we were in that neighborhood, like in Atlanta especially, what are you old white boys doing over here? But they knew we were black.
They was, I think, what you call kindred spirits. They was very close. In fact, I think Benny left and went to the Air Force. Ray went to the Air Force.
So we did things like in sequence. Like I was the first one to go into the Air Force. 2 years, I sent back money to the family to try to get them started. Then I'd take the last 2 years to get my college money. Raymond comes in, 2 years, Air Force, get money back home, get his college.
Ray joined the Air Force during the Korean War after 3 years in Atlanta. He went with the promise that the GI Bill would take care of college after his 4 years were up. It was an opportunity to break out of the extreme poverty that was all he had ever known. The Korean War was the United States' first fully integrated war. White and black soldiers shared barracks and a common enemy, but not much else. Andrews rarely talked about his time in the service, but once wrote, most white soldiers turned out to be downright resentful that their outfits were being racially integrated. Many black soldiers were given faulty equipment or no fighting gear at all. As common of Andrews, he writes about his most difficult times with a distant, third-person voice. He joked that what bothered him the most about Korea was the boredom.
Something went wrong, and supplies couldn't get in for a while. And the guys on the base had to watch the same movie over and over and over again. It was High Noon. And he said, I watched High Noon either 17 nights in a row or 17 times, but I remember 17 viewings of High Noon. And he said, every time I went, I tried to find something new in the movie. And he would talk about the way Gary Cooper wore his hat and if there were wrinkles in the shirt or, all these odd little things.
Raymond Andrews' habit of daydreaming was evolving into the writerly quality of careful observation. But he still lacked quality education, so after 4 years in Korea, he enrolled at Michigan State University. Raymond fell for college football at Michigan State. He lived more freely than he could have in the South, where he could not have attended a university. But he was still troubled by his racial identity. He was passing at Michigan State, meaning it was assumed he was white. He also protected the secret of his modest education.
When friends of mine who were interested in reading and becoming writers would get together with me, and we would be talking about, you know, Fitzgerald and Hemingway and, you know, pretty well-known writers. Ray, at least this is what he told me many years later, he said he didn't know who we were talking about. And that made him very shy about getting into any discussions with me about serious reading and writing.
Raymond was uneasy with the living situation at Michigan State, so he decided to leave after just 1 year. He made his way to New York City, where once again he met up with Benny. Benny had just finished studying at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he was exposed to the movement of abstract expressionism. But instead of joining that movement, he took the vibrant and colorful realism of his native South with him to New York. While Benny worked furiously at his art, Ray worked odd jobs and saw the world as it mingled in Manhattan. Eventually, he took a job as an agent for KLM Airlines. The Royal Dutch Airline employed a motley of would-be singers and dancers and artists who threw parties for the slightest of reasons. It was at one of these gatherings, a Christmas party, that he met an aspiring singer named Heidi Wenger Halter.
He just kept sitting next to me and already asking, can we have a date? Can we see each other afterwards? I said, well, let me think about it. I really don't know. I just came here.
Heidi was training for opera. This tiny, beautiful Swiss woman had a voice that would just knock the walls down.
She was Swiss. She spoke 5 or 6 languages. She had this wonderful accent.
From the beginning on, he was absolutely, I don't know, fascinated by me. I don't know why. So, yeah, we started actually dating immediately after we met at that girl's place.
Heidi and Raymond were wed a year later. They would travel much of Europe together and spend time in her home country. They shared an active and adventurous relationship. Benny had already married. He'd also fathered 3 children and established himself in the New York art world. He developed a unique style of narrative painting using bright colors, line drawing, and collage. He would go on to receive worldwide acclaim and would eventually become the first African American president of the National Endowment for the Arts Visual Arts Program. By the late 1970s, Benny was well on his way to fulfilling his dreams. Raymond's dreams were just taking shape.
He kept talking about he'd love to write, I said, well, if you want to write seriously, then do it. Do it. He said, well, how are you going to, live on what? I said, well, at that time, then I started working for Swiss Airlines. I said, I have a job, so don't worry about it. I'm sure we'll manage.
Ray didn't take Heidi up on her offer immediately, but the idea simmered in his mind.
He said, people have a story. He said, if you listen deep enough and hard enough, you will hear that story.
People interested him, and stories interested him, and he wanted to write.
I don't think there was anything he was trying to accomplish other than just to express himself. I think he just had felt since childhood a need to express himself.
One day, the urge became unbearable.
He was working for the airlines. Some guy was giving him a lot of crap over the telephone.
And it just decided he'd had it. And so he put the guy on hold and walked out. and as far as he knows, that guy could still be on hold.
Raymond immediately sat down and penned a short piece about how he and Benny had introduced the game of football to Plainview in their youth. It offered a glimpse into the rich imaginations of the poor youngsters. Sports Illustrated magazine quickly purchased it for $200. Little did he know how far he would have to stretch that $200.
He said, oh, there's nothing to this writing game. It's easy to do.
That, of course, gave him a lot of courage, you know, to really seriously sit down and really start writing. So that's what he did. He painstakingly sat down every morning. 5 o'clock he got up, even so he didn't have to.
Andrews rose early each day to craft a novel named for a character inspired by his beloved Uncle Bubba. The character was of mixed race and had been raised in Chicago. He ambles into the hometown that has forgotten him on Thanksgiving Day, 1945. Epigraphs throughout the novel are from the book of Revelation, and the upheaval that its mixed-race protagonist brings upon the segregated town of Appalachia is nearly apocalyptic.
It largely focuses on the story of Appalachia Red coming back to this town where he was sent away to the north when he was a child or a baby, and he comes back and takes over the town.
The book details a robust African-American community that survives and celebrates despite repression.
He doesn't have stories filled with race hatred. He has stories about people.
Some really terrible things happen in Appalachia Red. When Little Bit Thompson is almost killed and her husband is killed by this horrible Boots White. It's a terrible, terrible scene. And yet that happens, and then on to the next thing.
The stories are about how people who are living through, the most terrible forms of oppression. It's almost illegal to be who you are, It's almost that bad. That they find ways by storytelling and by building legends, legends of their own, as James Dickey says in another context. And that's what he was about as a writer. He was showing that.
I'll be frank with you. When I first started on Appalachia Red, I didn't even know how to do it because I'd never written a book. I had no idea how I was going to do it. So I just had to go to characters I wanted to appear, and I have to write about them. And truthfully, when I started writing, I didn't know how to bring characters in. I didn't know how to, for example, to bring them on stage. I didn't know how to do it. And so I had to write about one, then jump to the other one. Yet I had to keep it whereby I didn't stay away from one too long before I went back to it, to have the lives sort of entwined there. And it was sort of a seek and you should find type way of doing it.
It took Andrews just over 2 years to write the novel, but getting it published was another story.
Ray finished Appalachia Red, started sending it around. He would make jokes, said, the editors of the publishing houses all worked at the post office because it would almost beat me home.
A few days later, he was looking for some other agents in the telephone book and sending it out again, I said, don't worry, sometimes it will be bought.
First, I wanted to sell just short stories, something quick. I wanted to write a best-selling poem, make it quick, and of course, get a TV movie from it and TV miniseries, but it didn't work. So I knew I had to write the novel that I always wanted to write. And I started writing the novel, and it just carried on for about 2.5 years, and finished it. It didn't sell that easily. It didn't sell at all, in fact. It took about 9 years before I finally sold it.
Naive to the publishing industry, Andrews sent the manuscript to any business listed in the New York City phone book that called itself a publishing house.
It was a little unusual. My friend Yuri Djadjevics had a friend, David, who read for a very large agency that had what was essentially a reading service.
Well, you submit a manuscript and it's evaluated by someone allegedly knowledgeable, and then they recommend to you the boss's book on how to get published.
This has never been looked upon in a good way, this practice, by literary agents, because it's seen to be exploitive of writers.
He was feeling very guilty. He had found an actual book, an actual writer, and he really felt for this guy who was about to receive one of these letters from him saying, buy my boss's book. And so he couched the letter in such a way that it was very obvious as to what was going on, and sent me a copy, and said, basically get me off the hook, fix my conscience for me. And I read it. It was Appalachia Red. It was fantastic.
Years later, Jurjevic became the editor-in-chief of Dial Press. He had the power to publish the book, but the novel was unlike anything the industry had ever seen before, and promoting it was no easy task.
Ray's work is difficult in structure. It is not a straightforward chronological narrative. It's not an airport book.
The world wanted its blacks incarcerated, lynched, oppressed, in some way represented heroically by some white lawyer, and then they could have their role. But to have stories like this where the white world almost doesn't exist, except as some sort of peripheral outside force, there was no category for it.
Jurjevic had the idea to approach James Baldwin, who was with Dial Press at the time, about endorsing the novel.
So I approached Jimmy and gave him the script, and he read it, and he said, wow. And then we sort of talked him into presenting a James Baldwin Prize, and so the novel took the James Baldwin Prize.
Benny Andrews helped draw attention to the book by lending his art to its pages. Benny's depictions don't always echo the descriptions written by his brother, but there is a raw and refined quality to each of their styles that perfectly complements the other.
He and Benny were like each other's creative soulmates.
It was something that came out of that unknowable conjunction of brothers, of a shared childhood, and of outsiders.
The novel was well received critically, but financial returns were modest. Andrews took a job as a courier dispatcher as Dial prepared to publish a follow-up. Rosie Belle Lee Wildcat, Tennessee, also set in Muskegon County around Appalachia, was published in 1980. The title character was modeled after Andrews' grandmother, Jesse Lee Andrews. He decided to tell her story after visiting Heidi's grandfather.
He was being honored by the whole village, a little town right outside of Zurich, I guess about 45 minutes outside of Zurich, by the name of Dittikon. So we got there, and the whole day was just put aside for him. His grandfather had founded this village, and that goes back, I think, sometime in the early parts of the 19th century. Anyway, we sat there and talked and ate and drank. And I remember everybody was going up to him, talking to him, congratulating him upon his 85th birthday, and giving him presents and talking. That made me think that here it was, I was in Switzerland, this old man was talking about his past, and I was thinking that I had a past somewhat as interesting as his, and just as interesting, I thought, if not more so. And I wanted to write something about my grandmother, who was actually born before he was.
Raymond later wrote that his grandmother, who was a midwife, delivered practically every black baby born in Plainview. These children became her children. The book features many of her children, as well as her relationship with the white father of her real children.
This house was where my grandfather, James Orr, Mr. Jim, we had to call him, was born back in 1879. His family lived here, but this was the place where he met my grandmother. She worked for him. She was his mistress, which was typical for that time, but in the meantime, he didn't have a regular wife and children, so he was sort of looked upon as being a maverick.
Major newspapers praised the book, but financially, it brought in less than its predecessor. The contrast of critical success and financial shortfall frustrated Raymond Andrews. His private life suffered.
He was a very, very slow, painstaking writer, and he really devoted himself entirely to it. And that was the good news, and probably also the bad news. It didn't really allow him very much movement, either with the text or in his own life, with Heidi wanting, more normalcy.
It just sort of started drifting apart, without many words said. And so I told Ray, I said, I'd like to have a divorce.
The divorce was cordial by all accounts, but Andrews was about to lose another part of his life, and it would hurt even more.
the new ownership of Dell, which had previously owned Dial, was basically collapsing back in on itself in order to sell itself. And so by '85, there was no Dial. They had actually shut it down. I left 2 years before that, seeing what was going on.
Ray's biggest supporter was gone, and he found himself without a publisher. The final book in the Muskogee trilogy, Baby Sweets, set in a brothel where the clients and the staff were of varying races, went straight from the presses to the remaindering tables. Andrews continued to work and wrote a novel for Heidi, the only woman he would ever marry. But he couldn't find a publisher for that book or any future books set in Muskogee County. New York City, with its rising cost of living and shrinking publishing industry, was turning into a tough place to be a writer.
Now, he did indicate that being an African-American writer, and because of the way he wrote, that was very frustrating because he did not write from the point of view of the Harlem Renaissance, some of the writers that we know about who was centered in New York, who wrote about New York and urban experience, because he wrote about African-American folk life or culture in the South. That kind of put him in a different genre, and I think he was frustrated probably from the standpoint is that the publishing house did not know where to categorize him.
His way of telling a story was like Ray. It was like nobody else. That's what set him apart. And I think that was one of his great gifts. But to New York publishing, with its cookie cutter mentality, his books were kind of odd. They were a little bit misshapen to them,
But he didn't really care. He just wanted the writing. He needed the writing, and it's almost a cliche, one lives to write. One doesn't live to write. If you gave most people a choice between writing, or dying, they would choose the not dying and toss the writing. He wouldn't have. I don't think he would have. And in fact, I don't think he did. I think he actually made that choice somewhere at some level.
Ray Andrews chose to be a full-time writer. It was a choice he would never regret. But to do it, he would have to leave New York City. So he moved back south to Athens, Georgia, an artistic university town only 30 miles from the place of his birth. In 1984, Raymond Andrews went home.
When he moved here, it was a very exciting time in Athens. The town was really, really turned on. Music was big, the B-52s, REM. It was at the beginnings of all of that. Writers were starting to find Athens too.
I had an uncle who got caught selling bootleg liquor, and he got a year in the chain gang. And I saw him in those stripes once. I wanted to be a convict.
Well, I first saw Raymond read at the Roots in Georgia conference here in 1985. It was a great gathering that Stanley Lindbergh at the Georgia Review decided needed to happen, that all these great writers from the state of Georgia had never been recognized all together.
James Dickey, Philip Lee Williams, Terry Kay, I think Paul Hempel may have been there, Ann River Siddons, the big guns, and Ray Andrews was there.
His books were out of print in New York, and so it was the first time a lot of people in this area had heard about him.
It seems that soon enough, everyone in Athens knew Raymond Andrews. His down-home personality and knack for spinning tall tales over pitchers of cheap beer quickly became legendary in the town known as the Classic City.
He was only around at the beginning of the Globe, but he'd go there and he'd walk around town and talk to everybody, and then he'd end up at Harry Bissett's, the bar there, and there was a table in the front of the window, which he called the little round table, and he would sit there and hold forth with all the regulars there.
I never knew anybody who met Ray who didn't like him a great deal.
He's always smiling, always got a nice anecdote. If you don't want to talk about Faulkner, you can talk about the Atlanta Braves. He was that kind of guy.
Ray was a person who loved his environment, and he loved people. That was one of the most striking things about him personally, was his affection for the people.
Andrews applied for teaching positions at universities all over the Southeast, but was never granted one. He didn't have the academic stripes, but he spoke at schools when invited and taught informally just off the campus of the University of Georgia.
When he would always come by, basically, his fee was, beer or dinner, or as he said once when someone invited him someplace, just as long as I don't have to pay the transportation. And so, he would go to schools and talk to students for nothing. Students loved him. And he never had a problem getting beer in Athens.
He would talk to them in bars. He would encourage them. He would tell them books to read. He would let them send him, their stories. He would read it. So he had a big part with creating a lot of aspiring writers here in town.
Raymond connected with the instructors as well.
Jim Kilgo, Stan Lindbergh, the editor of the Georgia Review, Malcolm Call, who was then running the Georgia Press. All of them entertained him and looked out for him.
The friendship with Malcolm Call proved quite helpful. Ray Andrews' Muskogee trilogy was gone, but Malcolm Call brought it back with the reprinting arm of the UGA Press. The reissuing of Andrews' Muskogee trilogy introduced the books to a Southern audience. The works resonated there, where the social issues confronted by the characters were still alive. When Raymond Andrews first wrote about his home, it was just a memory to him. But Muskogee County was obviously Morgan County, and the town of Appalachia was really the county seat, Madison.
People drive down Main Street and it's a wealthy, upper class white neighborhood, and Raymond wrote the stories of the other side of the track.
There was never any doubt in my mind what Appalachia was.
Some Madisonians did not appreciate the stark representation of racism in his work. Andrews' perspective on their view was much the same he took towards his mother's view of his work. His mother did not like the harsh language used by many of his characters, but he always said, "You can't write for your mama."
To tell what happened, usually the way it happened, you always step on toes. Yeah. And people don't want to read or don't want to realize that this did happen or did not happen, whether it's white, black, or whoever. But I can't worry about stepping on toes. I can't. And being a true artist, I don't think you should. Even sometimes you want to write things to your way, as the way things you feel things should have been, rather than the way they were. But you can't do that. You have to write the way they were or the way they are.
For the most part, the locals enjoyed the books. 35 years had passed since Raymond Andrews left Madison at the age of 15. The civil rights movement had changed the town and the South forever. The former sharecropper, George Andrews, had made a radical transition too. Encouraged by his sons, the retiree had taken up painting seriously. He dabbed any object he could find with bright, primary colors, and he painted canvases with images from farms, outer space, and his own dreams. His estranged wife, Viola, had left for Atlanta. George became known as the Dot Man, and he lived the life of a bohemian artist in Madison. George Andrews was an artist for art's sake. He gave his work away. He never sold it. Much of it is now in folk museums in the Southeast and in private collections. The Andrews family was enjoying success very few could have predicted a half a century before.
Why is the Andrews family so talented? I think that's probably the $64,000 question. I've never known another family that had so many remarkably gifted people. I think largely it was due to Viola, who was a really remarkable woman in a lot of ways. But I think also there was a bit there of George Andrews, their father, who in his own way had a vision for what the world should be like, but really wasn't.
Raymond was about to have more good news too. The Last Radio Baby, a memoir about Raymond's youth in Georgia, was picked up by Peachtree Publishers, an Atlanta-based company. The book captured a distant time and place with witty stories of youth.
I met this person, a student, when I was working in New York, and he came up, a medical student. He came up to me and asked me, he said, "I understand when you were younger, there was no TV. And I said, well, not where I was. He said, well, what did you do? I said, well, we used to watch radio.
We did watch radio when I thought about it. We sat around, looked at the box, and these voices came out. And so I thought what I would do would write something about that period, not so much in the sense everything to do exactly with radio, but also what we did around that time too. It's sort of the generation of.
The memoir so accurately captured the time in the South before television that Charles Kuralt called it one of the truest and best pieces of writing I've ever come across. Once again, his book featured his famous brother's drawings. After its publication, Benny wrote Raymond a letter saying, "Congratulations over the selling of the last book. When things work out, it looks so easy, doesn't it? Nothing is worse than nothing happening." Ray had also written 2 novellas. They were soon published together, Jesse and Jesus and Cousin Claire, about 2 powerful but eccentric African-American women, eventually won an American Book Award. Contemporaries and critics began to understand the power of Raymond Andrews' unorthodox and unstudied writing style. It seemed that he lived the idyllic life that he'd always dreamed of. He typed long letters to his many friends around the country and joked that his typewriter couldn't spell. He tweaked his writing. He raised a little garden and took strolls by the lake with his cats.
I remember Ray telling me that on nice days he would get his yellow pad and his big pen and simply walk through the woods writing. And I asked him, aren't you afraid you're going to trip and fall? He said no. And he said he would do that for about 2 hours some mornings.
He, wrote in longhand, and then he typed on a typewriter, and he would keep, a copy of everything he was working on in the freezer in case the house burned down.
But as much as things seemed pleasant, there remained the fact that Raymond was making little to no money on the sale of his books.
I don't know what Ray's royalties were over the years. They can't have been much.
I don't think he made anything. I mean, it's really possible that out of Peachtree Publishers he didn't make anything.
Well into his writing career, Andrews faced a hard fact of the publishing industry.
There are fewer than 300 writers in America who make a living writing fiction when there's no income from any other source.
Serious fiction just doesn't make money, for the most part.
Just the idea that Ray thought he could live off of the kind of writing he did was curious.
After working for nothing in a cotton field, becoming a writer had meant everything to Raymond Andrews. But it also came with the risk that he could lose everything.
Ray's decision to be a full-time writer was something that I think he felt really compelled to do. I don't think it was something he took lightly. I think he understood very well what he was getting himself into and how difficult a position he was placing himself in. But I think that he had reached the point in his life where being nothing but a writer was something he was going to do or die.
In 1991, Raymond Andrews was 57 years old, and he was beginning to have health issues.
I was aware that he was complaining about his health, but he always said, oh, it's nothing serious, just a little outpatient surgery.
I, have heard rumors that it might have been a malignancy. I just don't know. I never found out. I never asked him. I never heard.
True to form, Andrews mostly kept quiet about the surgery. Regardless of the severity, he could not pay his doctor's bills, and past due notices piled up. Raymond depended on the kindness of many, and most of all, his brother Benny. It was in Benny's summer studio that Raymond lived most of each year since 1984.
The arrangement between him and my father was that he would be able to stay there if he took care of the property and basically, pay no rent. And I think my father saw that he was helping Raymond out because Raymond, I think, had decided that to really be a writer, he had to spend all of his time writing.
He had his room in Benny's place, but when Benny came for summers in Athens, Ray went for summers in New York.
And I'm not sure how happy Ray was with that arrangement.
Benny and Raymond Andrews shared an unknowable closeness most of their lives. They had risen from destitution to great heights. But Benny's heights were much more tangible, and it vexed Raymond.
I think there was very much the sense that Benny was something he had to live up to.
It did bother him to be second fiddle to Benny.
My uncle might make some kind of joke about how he did, nobody was paying attention to his work, or Benny was always, the successful brother.
And Raymond, I don't like it that you just see yourself as right, and I have to hustle for money, so you're going to have to hustle for some money too. I'm your Theo for a while. That's what he said. He was Van Gogh and I was Theo. But this seesaw is, it's too low. You're too low on the seesaw here. You're going to have to straighten this thing out. So yeah, it did get to be a contentious thing after a while. Yeah.
At an event that was supposed to feature both Ray's books and Benny's illustrations, Ray's jealousy boiled over.
Ray got there. Actually, I think he called me on the phone from the studio, if I remember correctly, just outraged that his books weren't there. And he said, well, what am I, the bastard child, the redheaded stepchild, it just, he had a competitive thing going on with Benny, and he was losing.
I think everybody who really succeeds at some point has some person against whom they match themselves and say, I think I can do that good. I think I can do as well as so-and-so. And I'm sure that Ray felt that. And let's face it, Benny was a hard act to follow, very hard act to follow. But I think, Raymond's success meant a lot to Benny. And I think as his life unfolded, writing got more difficult for Ray for a lot of reasons. His life got difficult for a lot of reasons.
Publicly, Andrews was generally his good-natured self, but privately, he suffered. He printed bitter notes on rejection letters from publishing houses and universities. Out of frustration, he typed angry letters to his brother.
When he decided to go full-time writer, it was a normal thing that I would literally support him. And since I had two places to live, it was convenient and everything. But when I talked about it in places, it finally got to the point where Raymond didn't want to do much of anything except write. And it was getting to be kind of like little too much on my supporting him. And that's when I started talking about him. Raymond, you're going to have to start readjusting things because it's getting a little too far over.
Raymond could not adjust, and his brother ordered him to leave the Athens studio. Benny wrote that he would travel down south over the Thanksgiving holiday in 1991 to oversee the transition. But Raymond would never leave. Raymond Andrews typed one last letter on November 24th. I've lived 57 plus good years, more or less doing things my way, he wrote. Now it's time for someone else to come on stage and see what they can do. I chose this life for myself, leaving the mainstream to write, and I don't regret one moment of it. One, I believe, makes one's own bed. I love all of y'all. Viola Andrews had a motto by which she forced herself to make it through times like these. Some things are too painful for tears. The feeling was shared by the family and the many friends of Raymond Andrews in the wake of his suicide.
When my mother called me that morning and told me that Raymond had killed himself, I just went crazy. I just went stone crazy.
It was really quite shocking.
I had no reason to expect that Ray would kill himself. Of all the people that I had known throughout my life, I never knew a single person ever who seemed to enjoy life as much as Raymond Andrews.
Of course, the person that cared about Raymond the most had the most difficult grieving process.
part of my life experience has been conditioned by that. And it's the kind of thing that will never go away. It's almost like raspberry or blackberry stains on a white shirt. But I don't allow myself to become preoccupied with that. Otherwise, it would consume me.
The last words Raymond Andrews ever typed were, "I love all of y'all." It is likely that Andrews meant that for everyone in his life, not just Benny and the other family members. He loved his family and friends as much as he loved writing, which he continued to do till his very last day.
I think it was very difficult for him towards the end of his life. He was unsure where he was going to go. His last book was nonfiction, part of his autobiography, and it was just very difficult for him, the prospect of publishing, of keeping published and everything. And I think that weighed on him a lot. But I think the joy of writing was something he never lost.
I do. I love it. I love. It's not easy. In fact, I don't think anything worthwhile. I don't think it's easy. I don't care what it is. I don't think it's easy. I don't think her working construction is easy. I don't think writing books are easy. I don't think shining shoes. If you do a good job, I don't think it's easy. But I think that her, as far as my writing goes, I love having created, completed. Like, for example, if I didn't write these books, or any writer didn't, they wouldn't get done. Now, maybe something similar might get done, but these books wouldn't do. The whole thing is having a blank sheet of paper, and I can create on that page these people, these characters, this setting. Only I can do that. Other people can create their own characters, but only I can create mine on that blank piece of paper. And I like that in being a writer. Most people, I think, want to be writers but don't want to write. But I love creating. It's hard. It's damn hard.
The joy of writing outlasted the joy of living, just as words on a page outlast flesh and bone. Writing mattered to Raymond Andrews, and it mattered to him to be recognized for it, as he was with the rest of his talented family at a ceremony in his hometown in February of 1990. For the occasion, Raymond Andrews wrote, "While growing up in Morgan County, I always wanted to be somebody else, somewhere else. I wanted to be somebody else in places like New York City, Hollywood, even Russia. But after leaving Morgan County and traveling to many of these places, I was to learn that no matter where you went, you always took along yourself, the only somebody you'll ever be. I also found out that other writers I'd read from other parts of the country and world wrote mainly about where they came from and how these places made them who they were. When I began writing, I realized that the place and people I came from could be just as interesting to write about and to read about as any other place or people in the world. Now that I've grown up and I'm doing what I've always wanted to do, write, I no longer want to be somebody else, somewhere else." Raymond Andrews left a legacy of creativity and tenacity, of idealism and humility, of loyalty and friendship.
It matters that there's an effort to keep alive what he did and to keep his spirit alive, because he had a great spirit. If we're going to celebrate anything in the life of writers, let us celebrate that. And they did it out of passion, they did it with love, and they cared for their subject. They were just word makers. And once in a while, we ought to pause and pay attention to what those words meant for people who love them.
Make no difference. Maybe my time would be better spent living for Jesus or raising a sun. Now that you've seen it, now that I've poured out my heart into you, I'm closer to knowing what I'm made of. And now it seems it's come to be just as much a part of me as knowing your place is part of the greater good. Show me the man who leaves nothing to chance, and I'll show you happiness. It ain't just for show, it's all that I know. It ain't much, but it's what I do best. Oh, it ain't much, but it's what I do best. It's what I do best. It's what I do best. Hey, it's what I